Report.
Good evening, welcome to the Bolt Report. I'm Steve Price. I'm filling in for Andrew this week. He'll be back with you next week. Actually going to catch up with Andrew later this hour. I can tell you, and I think he mentioned it Thursday night, he is in Israel, seeing for himself the latest on the conflict that's been raging, of course, since the October 7 terror attack by Hamas on Israeli territory. Now, it was a big weekend for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and social media dancing along to Taylor Swift in Sydney. And then he jumped on his taxpayer-funded jet to Melbourne, went to a private party with singer Katy Perry at billionaire Anthony Pratt's Pile-in Kew. Now, I'll get our panel's view on how that plays out during a cost of living crisis shortly. Victoria is Australia's worst performing state Labor government, as we know, again tying itself in knots over illegal drug consumption. Again, not content with their mangled heroin injecting room in Richmond, it's now delayed a second venue despite wasting millions of dollars, and now plans a giant pill testing experiment. We'll look at that later. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is 2 years in and more deadly by the day. The Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, on whether there is any hope to an end of that illegal invasion. Plus, two national polls out today showing support for federal Labor is on the slide, with cost of living pressures biting right across the nation. Just how much trouble are they in? We'll debate that as well as we go through the evening. But first, though, a slice of typically aspirational Australia will this Saturday cast a vote in a by-election in southeast suburban Melbourne. I say typical because, and I know this area well, the medium age there is 39. Younger families, many renting because 13 rate rises later, they can't afford a home loan. The area is typical of many Australian commuter suburbs. It's growing in number. At last census, I looked up today, around 140,000 people live in Frankston alone. That's at Dunkley Centre. A population swollen by home hunters from closer into Melbourne, trying to get cheaper housing, and migrants trying to get a foothold. These are the people once referred to as John Howard's battlers, a reference, of course, to John Howard and Western Sydney in the early 2000s. And these are the people, if Peter Dutton wants to win a federal election this year or next, that Dutton has to appeal to. By-elections are typically tricky to predict, and Labor holds this seat by a fraction over 6%. Around Australia, I'm told there are 12 federal seats with slimmer margins than that. Make no mistake, Saturday and the Dunkley result is going to have a major impact on the futures of both Peter Dutton and the Prime Minister. Now, the quality of individual candidates and the raft of independent and minor candidates running is almost irrelevant. This is a poll of 111,000 registered voters on the biggest issues, mainly the cost of living, and who those 111,000 voters blame for mortgage increases, crippling rents, power bills that never went down as Labor promised they would, petrol prices and checkout pain at Coles and Woolies and Aldi. It's also a poll on something politicians on both sides don't really want to talk about, immigration. More particularly, how many people are coming into Australia and where they're coming from. People are not mugs. They know jamming another 750,000 people into largely Sydney and Melbourne is unsustainable. Official figures from the Bureau of Stats as of December last year showed that migrant arrivals were up a staggering 73% to 730,000, up from 427,000 a year earlier. More than half of those were temporary visa holders, the sort of people who gravitate to places like Frankston in search of cheaper rent. Now, Labor's had its finger on the fast-forward button when it comes to migration, and many Australians, me included, believe it's time to hit the pause button. Now, Melbourne is set to become Australia's biggest capital city by population as soon as 2025 next year. Dunkley is also on the fringes of a serious crime spree involving gangs of young home invaders, terrifying residents asleep in their beds at night, confronted with weapons and having their cars stolen and torched. Frankston itself, it's got its own issues with homelessness, drugs, youth unemployment and petty crime. Now, my colleague Paul Murray is in Frankston tonight and will bring you an edition of his famous by-election pub test, with locals able to fire questions at candidates. I'll join him there after a dash from here to Frankston. You want me to tell you who won't be there tonight? And I believe this is an outrage for the voters in that seat. Labor has banned their candidate, or she might have banned herself, Jody Bellier, will not be attending, and neither will some bloke called Alex Breskin, who is the Greens candidate. You wonder what they might be afraid of. A tough question for Labor, maybe, on migration, or that power bill that was a broken promise, or for the Green bloke on how he expects the good people of Dunkley to be able to splash out on buying an electric vehicle. It's a gutless decision and a statement of what to expect if either of them were to be elected. You'd be voting for someone who goes missing when the going gets tough. The Libs' Nathan Conroy will front up, and I presume a number of the fringe candidates. I'll get an idea from my first panel up next. Experienced political operative Michael Kroger and Rashina Campbell from the Melbourne City Council, and someone who herself has stood for a by-election in a federal by-election. Joining me now, as I said, is Michael Kroger. Michael, great to see you here.
Steve.
And Rashina, you've been through a by-election. They're pretty tough, aren't they?
They are tough, Steve, but I think there's something very important in this one. Cost of living has really started to bite, and I think we will see that in Dunkley. You look at that mortgage belt area, Frankston, Carrum Downs, Langwarrin, people there are struggling, and this will be a chance for them to send a message to Anthony Albanese that they're doing it tough and he hasn't done enough.
You've seen more by-elections than I've had hot dinners, Michael. Can you read this one? Is it possible to predict it?
Well, the swing should be between 3 and 4%. OK, if it's less than 3, it's disappointing for Dutton. If it's more than 4, it's disappointing for Oboe. Why do I say that? Because the best comparison for this by-election is the Aston by-election in 2001 when the Liberal member passed away. People don't feel like voting against the incumbent party. They're only at a by-election because the previous member died. They don't feel they should take out their disappointment or anger with the government at the by-election. It might be a different story at the general election, but this should be a win for Labor with 3 to 4%. That's the ballpark as far as I can see it. But if Labor lose, oh my God, and it's certainly a bad decision to not have their Labor candidate fronting up tonight. That'll cost them a couple hundred votes.
Except the way I
minimum.
described that area?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really good example of what the cost of living is doing to average Australians. We're not talking here about, I mean, there's bits of Dunkley if you go down to Mount Martha perhaps, or Mount
Eliza. Yeah, that's a bit more affluent.
Around there. But the rest of it is aspirational Australians who want to get ahead.
Yep. It's a hard seat for the coalition because since the great Bruce Bilson held it, there's been a 4% redistribution, of course. Yeah, 4% swing against because of the redistribution. So this is a Labor seat. But boy, it's Middle Australia. There are some tough Labor areas, very strong Labor areas, but there are aspirational areas like up at Carrum Downs, where big mortgage belt area. So this is going to be a
even
tough
the issue
test.
of petrol. I mean, I live beyond Dunkley. And, you do spend a lot of money on petrol. And
Absolutely.
These people, a lot of them are travelling. I mean, I see the tradies on the move every day at 6:30 in the morning, driving around in the utes that Chris Bowen wants to take off them. They're everywhere. They're like, mosquitoes. And so they would be really feeling that pain when it comes to buying fuel.
Absolutely. Fuel prices, energy prices, grocery prices, it's hitting home in a place like Dunkley. The other thing to remember is these are people who can be pretty annoyed at Anthony Albanese for sending them to the polls on The Voice, because overwhelmingly, with the exception of Mount Eliza, this is a constituency that voted no. So while they were facing a cost of living crisis, he put them to the polls and they sent him a clear message there.
That's a really good point. I want to get to the news poll in a moment, guys, but I'm hoping I'm not making too much of this. But we do need to call out media hypocrisy, I reckon, when we see it. I mentioned the Prime Minister and Taylor Swift, good on him, and then he dashed down to Melbourne to be at that private party at Anthony Pratt's function with Katy Perry. He did a stand-up, I think, in Dunkley on Sunday to talk about the by-election we were just talking about. But what about a visit to the bushfire front in the Grampians? That's been burning since last week. Houses destroyed, more pain tipped coming this Wednesday. No debate, though, in the media about the PM dropping into an evacuation centre that exists there. No media debate and no criticism. I mean, compare that to what happened to Scott Morrison. I know it was silly of him to go to Hawaii when those fires were on. He now accepts that. Why don't we criticise Anthony Albanese the same way?
Well, this is the double standards of the press, Steve. I mean, why isn't he visiting Beaufort, around Ballarat, where there have been fires, western parts of Victoria, where there have been fires, houses destroyed? This is a big crisis in Victoria, by the way, for those non-Victorians here. But yet this bloke Albanese, people as old as you and I, Steve, will remember that famous TV ad, the Peter Stuyvesant jet set.
Yes.
Remember that jet set for all those smokers? This is this bloke. There isn't a private jet this bloke won't get into. And he's at a concert on Friday night. He's down there at another concert Saturday night, which was important events at that dinner at the Pratt's place, and they make a great contribution to this country. But Albo's everywhere. You find a private jet and a pop concert, Albo will be there, particularly if it's free.
He's not Albanese. Well, he's Alba Freebie, isn't he?
The Liberals would not get away with what he's gotten away with here.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think the rest of Australia probably, Michael makes a good point, don't understand how bad these fires are. And there's temperatures tipped for Wednesday. They're going to be again in the high 30s with a lot of wind. We could have another, God forbid, Black Saturday disaster there on Wednesday. The PM had every opportunity to jump in a car or a chopper and go up to that area on Saturday or Sunday.
Absolutely, and this is not the first time he's done it. It's worth remembering. Last year, he was at the Australian Open while the scenes in the Northern Territory were incredibly distressing. Spent a few hours there and then night at the tennis. So he has shown his priorities. He is not in touch with those people struggling, whether it's the bushfires, whether it's the NT. He's just interested in having a night out.
What is it, Michael? His antenna's not right? Has he got bad advice in his office? I noticed he brought in this bloke, David Epstein, last week, who's very experienced. Maybe they've worked out that he's not getting the right messages.
Keating once said this. He said, never forget it's not about you, it's about the position you hold. This bloke thinks it's about his riveting, charismatic, magnetic personality that is getting invited to all these events because he's such a magnificent individual.
He'll be dropped like a stone.
He'll be dropped. They won't see this bloke. He won't see a first-class flight for private jet for the dust. Once this bloke's out of office, you'll never see him again at any of these events. Albo's got to remember, you're only being invited to these things because you're Prime Minister.
Correct.
Stop accepting these free tickets to the tennis, as Rashina said, when you make a great point. When Alice Springs was in serious trouble, he went there for 4 hours on his jet and left again.
And nothing's happened since.
And nothing. Has he been back since? No. This bloke's got to get his feet back on the ground because he Paul Murray calls him Airbus Albo. I mean,
well, if he goes back
seriously.
If he goes back 4% on Saturday night...
More than that, he's in trouble.
I mean, the Sharks will start circling with his own party. I mean, he's already got, Jim Chalmers and Bill Shorten sitting there very quietly waiting for him to fall over. Just on that, no good news for them. In Newspoll, latest poll, Newspoll showed primary vote for Labor dropped 1 point to 33%. Anthony Albanese's approval rating remains in negative territory. The Coalition's position remains unchanged at 36, but that's not good news ahead of Dunkley. There was some other polling. The Resolve polling came out today as well, Rashina, this time from the Nine papers. They've got the Coalition actually lifting from 34 to 37. That's its strongest position since the last election. You stood in Aston. You were not successful, sadly, for the people of Aston. But do you get a sense that this government already is on the nose?
I think we're in a very different situation now where Albanese was in a honeymoon period a year ago. People now say you have been in the hot seat for a while and you need to start delivering for us, because he talked a big talk about bringing down everything from interest rates to inflation. None of that has happened. Now, whether this is a sign that we see at the by-election, a shift away from the ALP, or maybe it's a matter for the general election, but it is clear the tide is turning. And what I see is the opportunity for the Coalition. They've got to step up and do the hard policy work now to make the case to Australian voters why they are the better economic managers, while we cannot afford another term of Labor.
Michael, it's a pity that the local Victorian Liberals are not doing their bit of the heavy lifting. I mean, I was watching Peter Credlin in the last hour and they seem to just be completely out of touch on things like global warming and climate change.
Well, I wish my friends in the State Parliamentary Party would start releasing some big policy ideas, because that's what you need to do. If you look at what Dutton's doing, Dutton has spent the last year and a half...
I wanted to ask you about Dutton.
Dutton's been defining himself. As Rashina said, people are starting to get... Labor's going down, Dutton's going over. People are getting a sense of who Peter Dutton is. And I'd say to the Victorian Parliamentary Liberal Party, my friends there, you can't waste a day in opposition. They've got to start defining who they are, and you do that through big policy ideas, and I think that's what they've got to do sooner rather than later. Just
quickly before we go, Rashina, the state government, they're not going to have a second heroin injecting room now. They bought a building, so they still own that in Flinders Street. That's empty. But the news in the Sunday Herald Sun yesterday that they might have a massive statewide pill testing regime in medical centres.
Well, the first thing to say is if there's going to be no injecting room in the CBD, hallelujah. Because I, for one, think after the shambles of their first injecting room, this is something Melbourne cannot afford. But as to pill testing, why on earth does the government think it is a good idea to send the message, particularly to young people, that drugs are a safe option?
Yeah.
Where is the investment in rehabilitation, in deterrence, in making sure that we are not creating a generation that thinks this is a way to be spending your time and your money? I am very concerned by the message it sends when they say there's a safe way to do drugs. That is not what we want to hear from a government.
Well said. Thank you both, Michael Kroger and Rashina Campbell there. Thank you very much for your time tonight. After the break, now, as I mentioned, our great friend Andrew Bolt, who's normally in this chair, will be back with you next week. He'll join us from Israel. He's got some very sobering messages for anybody who thinks Israel should back down in this conflict. Andrew's up next. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, I'm filling in for Andrew this week because Andrew has travelled to Israel. He's going to join us each night with exclusive footage and information from the front line, and he joins us from Israel. Great to see you, my friend. I mean, can you give me some sort of a feeling of the mood of the nation of Israel? Is it possible to do that?
A good question, Steve. It's fascinating. We have a debate in Australia whether Israel should keep fighting or stop or ceasefire or whatever. No debate here at all. Absolutely none, apart from a few minor figures. People I talk to of the left and the right are both absolutely united. This war must be fought and must be fought and won. And when you actually see what they've gone through and what's at stake, just down the road, 45 minutes away, is Gaza. You wouldn't believe there's a war going on there right now, right here in Tel Aviv. I mean, people are running exercises, playing on the beach, although a guy just walked past me with a submachine gun, so people are aware. I was talking to a top general yesterday, a war hero from the Six-Day War, and he pulled out a pistol from his ankle holster and said, "I'm ready." That's how they feel here. This is a war that must be won.
And you don't have to go far, do you, Andrew, outside of where you are right now to see the effects of what happened on October 7. Tell me about that kibbutz you went to, which is a rather unique place, but a deadly place. I think 30 people died. There was more than 30 people died, and a lot of people were kidnapped. What was that like to visit?
Well, it's extraordinary. I went to two sites down the road down there. Like I say, they were about 40 minutes away. One was a kibbutz and one was the field where there'd been a sort of peace concert. And it was extraordinary. I'll tell you about both. Firstly, kibbutz. It's a socialist kibbutz. I mean, you see the left marching, Israel, anti-Israel, anti-Israel. This was a socialist kibbutz. They all share their income. And I walked down the path and you see the pictures outside the houses that were destroyed. They still haven't been rebuilt. And the pictures that hang there of people kidnapped or killed. 105 people killed, 30 kidnapped, some released. There's about 11 still missing, but they reckon 5 or 6 are dead. And this is just one of the streets, right? I'm not picking out one house here, one house there. Just walk down the street and left, right. The terrorists went through shooting dead people, whoever they found, peaceniks, elderly couples. In one house, I couldn't believe it. I walked in. The man and woman were both killed. I think they were in about their 60s or something like that. I walked into where the terrorists must have chased one of them, machine gun bullets everywhere, that even shot up the computer screen. It was like a war on modernity. It was just extraordinary. Someone must have hidden there. You see the bullets in the wall, and then the computer screen shot dead. What is that? That's apart from the sheer brutalities of the people. I noticed soldiers going up and down there, like paying pilgrimage, reminding themselves what they're fighting for. There are even more. There are a couple of hundred soldiers at the next place I went to, which is the killing field. That was a peace concert of all things. 400 people there, everyone with their picture on a pole, trees planted for all of them. Some of the people you see there, well, look how young they are. They're no threat to anyone. Deliberately massacred. This is not accidental collateral damage. This is a deliberate massacre. And there were hundreds of soldiers in the car park there getting rousing speeches, being given rousing speeches. They're being reminded what they're fighting for. And I tell you, the spirit is just incredible. And they look at the Western world saying, stop, stop, stop. And as that general, that war hero told me, we're not going to stop because It's two people fighting for the one bit of land, and Israel knows if they lose, they're gone. Because Hamas doesn't want them a peace deal. They've been offered peace deals. They want Israel destroyed, and these people know it.
You're in a unique position in that you've come out of Australia within days and you're where you are now and you've seen the horror of what happened on the 7th of October. Do you think any of the people who are demonstrating back here, any of the anti-Semites that have shocked Australia since that time, do you think any of them would have their minds changed if they could stand where you stood yesterday and looked at the faces of those dead young people?
Oh, they'll be saying, what about the babies of Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't realise this is a war for Israel existence. They're trying to end a war that started, 76 years ago, with when about 4 Arab nations, 5 tried to destroy Israel. A lot of the refugees come from there. 750,000 fled Israel. There are now 6 million refugees registered with the United Nations, paid for by us, a particular refugee agency just for them, UNRWA, and they've traded for 76 years on victimhood. We've had so many refugees populations since. They don't have a UN agency for them. 10 million Germans kicked out of Eastern Europe after World War II. 40 million Hindus and Muslims kicked out of India and Pakistan in the partition. 3 million refugees of the Korean War. They've all gone and made new lives. So the Palestinians, no. It's their victimhood that gives them the status and the money, and it's bred a culture of hatred of Israel because that's their reason for existence. But if they did come here, Steve, I tell you, they would see, they say apartheid state. They'd see Arabs walking down here, just Jaffa down the road. I just had a meeting at a business, a media business there. They employed Arabs and Israelis and Jews, right there. Where's the apartheid state? I don't see it. It's just ridiculous.
Just finally, Andrew, I mean, you're standing there on the famous beachfront in Tel Aviv. How close to Gaza do you think you're going to get, and is it safe to go down that far?
Well, I was hoping to go inside Gaza. The IDF was saying, well, we can't take any journalists right at the moment, so I don't know what that's about. I'll try again. But where I was yesterday, you could hear the artillery, the Israeli artillery, boom, boom, boom. Probably 15 times when I was there. And the closer you get, obviously, you get more and more military and military vehicles. But the striking image for me really was all those. This is my 4th visit to Israel, and I've been once before to the West Bank. I got to say again, I've paid for this trip. I've gone on. This is my holiday. You'll know, Steve, Israeli soldiers used to go to Masada, a thing in the desert, high on a hill where the Romans had conquered a rebellion and found all the people who held out to the very last committed suicide. That's the story. And soldiers go up there to pledge their defense of the Israeli state. And they say, Masada must never fall again. Now the soldiers are doing it to these sites here, to the massacre sites. They do not want this again. When they say never again, they mean never again. That's what they're fighting for.
Andrew, it's great to have a perspective from someone on the ground, and congratulations on being there. I look forward to sitting in your hot seat this week and talking to you each day and get your insight into what's going on. Good on you, mate. Look after yourself.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, staying with foreign affairs, joining us now, the Australian's foreign affairs editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, I think you heard what Andrew had to say there, particularly the issue of the Israelis. They're not for backing off. They're not for doing deals. They want to rid themselves of Hamas. You agree with what Andrew is observing?
Yes, I think Andrew's analysis is very accurate. The Israelis would do a temporary ceasefire and a hostage deal, but they won't do a hostage deal on Hamas's terms. So Hamas wants all kinds of crazy things. They want thousands of Palestinians released. They want a permanent ceasefire. Israel can't leave Hamas in power in the Gaza Strip. It has to destroy the Hamas battalions in the south of the Gaza Strip. Steve, it strikes me that there's a real weirdness about the moral debate here. why doesn't everybody, including Penny Wong and everybody else, immediately call on Hamas to surrender? The Hamas war criminals should come out from hiding, stop causing this terrible suffering for their own people. You know, in the tens of miles of tunnels that they built, there's not a single bunker to shelter Palestinian civilians. It's all about Hamas and Hamas's power. They bear all the moral responsibility for the suffering their people are enduring. So why doesn't the international community, the United Nations and everyone else say, yes, we want this terrible suffering in Gaza to stop, and the way it can stop is for the Hamas leaders to lay down their arms and come out and surrender. They don't have to be subject to Israeli justice. They can go to the International Court of Criminals and be tried for war crimes.
You make an excellent point. Has any government anywhere other than Israel called for Hamas to lay down their arms and walk away?
Well, part of the ambiguity of the Albanese government, the Albanese government are not wicked on this, but they're ambiguous and weak. Part of their ambiguity is they say Hamas must have no future in the governance of Gaza. Then they call on Israel to instantly have a ceasefire. So how can you get to the position where Hamas has no influence on the future governance of Israel, and Hamas is an illegal proscribed terrorist organisation under Australian law, so we wouldn't allow an organisation like that to control a slice of territory that we were responsible for. So there just seems to be a kind of a hypocrisy in the international community. I mean, the United States, I think, has called for Hamas to surrender, but they don't. That's not their primary note, and I don't know why. I just don't know why it isn't.
Well, talking about the US, we saw on Saturday, I was checking my phone constantly to see what was going to happen in South Carolina. I think it was Sunday our time. Nikki Haley got beaten soundly by Donald Trump. She's staying in the fight, even though she did get beaten badly. Is that about her pitching her name out there for next time, rather than thinking she's got any hope of winning the Republican nomination this time?
Well, Steve, you're right. It's very unlikely she's going to win the Republican nomination. But Nikki Haley is getting a not trivial vote. 40% of South Carolina voted for Nikki Haley, 42% of New Hampshire. Now, it'll be interesting to see how she goes in Michigan and the Super Tuesday states. But, you know, there are a lot of perplexing things out of that result. First of all, Trump is going to need all of her voters if he's going to win the presidency. He's going to need all the Republicans plus some others. So, it was smart of him not to demonise her in his victory speech after South Carolina, unlike his victory speech after New Hampshire. It is also still possible that some shocking legal development may render Trump ineligible, impossible for him to be the candidate if he goes to jail on a criminal charge. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's possible. Now, if Nikki Haley has racked up really big votes in the Republican primaries, it'll be hard for the party to ignore her. And then finally, as Trump's own career demonstrates, in the United States, fame itself is power and money. And I think Nikki Haley has done better than I expected her to. I thought Ron DeSantis would be the alternative to Trump. And she's racking up fame, and therefore she's racking up power and money, and she's racking up future influence. I think it's no bad thing that she's staying in the contest while ever she's getting something like 40% of the vote. If she's getting 2% of the vote or something, well, obviously she should bail out straight away then.
Forgive me if I've missed this, but has she ruled out being a vice presidential candidate in a ticket with Trump?
She sort of said she's not interested in it, and Trump says he wouldn't do it. But, these declarations really mean nothing at all. One of Trump's attractive virtues, if I can say that, Steve, is an extreme pragmatism about what might work. Now, I certainly think Nikki Haley has been very careful in her criticisms of Trump, and she hasn't gone nuclear in her criticisms of Trump. And I certainly think the way is open for her to endorse Trump as the Republican candidate as being a better alternative than Biden. And Trump, I think, if he keeps winning, he should, do something really novel and be gracious in victory, because 40% of people voting against him in a Republican primary and voting for Nikki Haley, that's a significant chunk of folks that he needs. He needs them in November. And she can't move them like chess pieces, but obviously she'll have some influence with them.
Yeah, he might just do that. Just finally, Greg, I can still remember where I was when Russia went over the border into Ukraine, said they were going to take 4 days to bowl Kyiv over and take over Ukraine. It's now been 2 years. Have you got any optimism for me that this war at any point in time is going to be over?
Well, not really, Steve, to be honest with you. This is a grim moment we've reached, a grim moment. The Ukrainian sacrifice has been heroic and magnificent and just unbelievable, really. I mean, Russia is 4 or 5 times as big as Ukraine and right on the border and devotes an enormous amount of its resources to weaponry. The Ukrainians haven't asked for a single foreign soldier to help them. They've just asked for weapons and ammunition. Now, at the moment, the Republicans in Congress are holding up $60 billion worth of aid. This is not money to go to Ukraine. This is money the United States would spend on its own arms manufacturers to buy weapons for Ukraine, and it would come out of the defence budget, so it wouldn't add to the deficit or the debt. The Europeans, I think, can't bear the thought of doing anything without the Americans, and I'd say the Albanese government has been pathetic in the aid that it's given Ukraine, you know, burying the Type N helicopters at a rate of knots rather than giving them to Ukraine, and now they're probably going to do the same with our Abrams tanks. So a lot of people around the world are finding an excuse not to support Ukraine. Putin doesn't care how much suffering he inflicts on his own people. And the tide of battle is starting to turn. I think now you would hope that it might become a frozen conflict at some point and we'll get a ceasefire. But whereas Ukraine had the initiative 9 months ago, I'd say Russia has the initiative now, but these things can change.
Great assessment, Greg Sheridan. Always a pleasure to catch up with you. That's Greg Sheridan. Now, coming up after the break, the majority of Australians, according to a poll today, would back a move toward nuclear energy. But is the Albanese government listening? Of course they're not. More next. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, Steve Price sitting in all this week for Andrew Bolt. Andrew, to his credit, has travelled at his own expense to Israel. We'll be talking to Andrew each night about the latest of the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Andrew will be back with us tomorrow night. He'll be back with you in the chair next week. Now, I mentioned earlier about the results from the Australian newspaper's news poll earlier in the program. Labor has dropped to its lowest support since the election. They are on a primary vote now of 33% compared to the coalition's 36%. But one interesting aspect for me of this news poll, and I did a fair bit on nuclear energy on my own program on Friday last week, was 2/3 of younger Australians admit they would back a move to replace coal-fired power plants with small modular nuclear reactors. Now, I must say these numbers even surprised me, including, of course, that a number of Greens have supported it. Joining me now is Liberal MP Garth Hamilton and history lecturer and author Stephen Chavura. Start with you, please. First, the pressure, guys, is growing to lift this ban on nuclear energy. You think the government's listening at all, the federal government?
I don't think it can. Sorry, I don't think it can because Chris Bowen has ruled out nuclear energy on numerous occasions. They've stood fast on a reckless commitment to renewables for years now. And in fact, Labor's commitment to renewables is a gift to the Liberal Party. Australia has, once upon a time, paid the 4th lowest energy prices in the world. Now it pays, I think, the 10th lowest. And this is all under a policy of pursuing renewables. So the Labor Party has really painted itself into a corner, and this is a fantastic opportunity for the Liberals to really stand by their policy of allowing nuclear energy to bring down energy prices and promote clean energy.
Garth, I look, though, at Chris Bowen whenever he appears either in Question Time or in one of his more manic media conferences. It doesn't strike me, Garth, that he's going to ever utter the words nuclear for Australia.
He's dug himself into a corner, hasn't he? And I think Manock describes a lot of his utterances very, very well. Look, these numbers don't surprise me at all. I ran a poll in my own electorate of Groom, 1,800 people, and 69% of respondents wanted to see us lift the ban. Times have changed. People aren't listening to Midnight Oil anymore. People have moved on. And you see young people coming through with a different point of view. They see the opportunity there, and Australia has great opportunity. As a mining engineer, I worked at Ranger, Olympic Dam, great uranium mines in Australia. We're safely extracting this material. We've got some of the highest standards in the world, but everyone else is benefiting from that work, not Australia. It's ridiculous that this is something that we're excluding ourselves from.
Yeah, I think both of you, what we need in this country at the moment is a little bit of self-interest. I note that David Littleproud, who's been quite strong on nuclear, he welcomed these results this morning. Here's what he had to say.
Let's have some political courage and leadership in this country rather than taking us down this reckless pathway that's pushing up energy bills but doesn't look at all the energy solutions and doesn't put us into a concentration of energy solution.
Stephen, do you think he's going to hold Peter Dutton to going to an election and having this as a policy? I mean, I can just see there is still within the Liberal Party, as we know, some of the left and some of the wets in the Liberal Party who would have night sweats thinking that they're going to go out to their electorate and say, we're going to advise you that you're going to have a nuclear reactor in your backyard.
That's true. You're always going to have the NIMBYs, and that's something that the Liberals are going to have to deal with. But I do think the Liberals need to treat this as the gift that it is. Energy prices are going up. Labor is committed to doing nothing about that other than really making it worse by this commitment to renewables. So this is a gift that the Liberal parties need to seize upon and really push it at the next election.
Garth, I mentioned at the beginning of the program, and I was talking about Dunkley and this by-election that's coming up on the weekend, that one of the issues, whether the government wants to admit it or not, it's got to be immigration. I mean, you've got 140,000 people who live currently in the wider Frankston area. That's going to be 160,000 within the next 4 or 5 years. Melbourne's going to be the biggest capital city in the country. All of these migrants are coming into Australia, sponsored by the government. They're just letting anyone come who wants to come. Immigration has to be an issue, doesn't it?
It has to be an issue, and we have to be upfront to the Australian people about it. We saw in Question Time today the Minister for Immigration refusing to accept there's a link between immigration and the housing crisis that we're all currently experiencing, particularly younger Australians, people trying to get onto that property ladder. There is a link, and we need to be open and honest with Australia about it. Under the last years of the last coalition government, we had a cap of 160,000 people a year. We saw 500,000, so 3 times that number, come through in the previous 12 months. And the telling thing is, Stephen, on this point, we only saw 162,000 new dwelling approvals in the same period. So we're getting more people in. We're already struggling with the housing crisis. The problem's going to get worse and worse, and the government needs to take some ownership of a problem that is entirely of their making.
Yeah, the front bench looked very uncomfortable when they were asked questions about it today. Let's have a little look at what unfolded in Question Time.
Over 500,000 visas have been granted under the Albanese Labor government in the past year, with more than 1.6 million projected to be granted over the next 5 years. Does the minister agree that this is putting immense pressure on housing, transport and basic services, on top of a cost of living crisis already being faced by Australian families?
The Albanese government is getting on with fixing Australia's broken immigration system. A system broken by those opposite, and no more so than when the Leader of the Opposition was the minister responsible.
Stephen, when's someone going to get honest with the Australian people? I mean, if you go to an open inspection of an apartment that someone's put up for rent these days, and I had personal experience of this last year, I saw a queue of 100 people wanting to queue up for a 2-bedroom dark apartment that wasn't particularly pleasant, trying to get their hands on it because they've got nowhere to live.
Absolutely, and I've been in that situation myself when we were looking to rent and looking to buy, and it's incredibly demoralising. And again, this is just another gift that the Labor Party is giving to the Liberal Party if the Liberals will but receive it, and that is to be strong on cutting immigration. Australians are actually very passionate about immigration. They're very passionate about borders, and we all remember back in the early 2000s when the Howard government introduced the turning back the boats policy. The Labor Party was brought to the necessity of strong borders, kicking and screaming. The Labor Party has always been about bringing in as many people as they can to build up a voter base. It's always been about weaker borders. This is something that the Liberal Party can really lead the way on and really really sell to Australia again at the next election, that they are the party of Australia first, the party of lower immigration, the party of tough borders.
I agree with that. Garth, the pro-Palestinian protesters, now we had Andrew in Israel just before on the program, I'm sure you saw that. They've ramped up their language to a point where it's absolutely disgusting now. Have a look at what happened outside the Melbourne Town Hall last week.
There is something very nice we say in Palestine Arabic. It's great. Every single martyr died, they go to their houses with a sweet. And they shout to his mother, said, "You are very lucky. I wish my mom in your place." How are you going to defeat us when we wish our mothers has the martyr in her house?
Garth, it's not a stretch to label that hate speech. Why would the police not clear that mob out of there?
Look, I think there are some big questions here. I'd ask, we have laws on incitement to violence. And if this doesn't meet that threshold, maybe we need to be reviewing those laws. Is clearly encouraging families to encourage terrorists within their family group. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement to be making in public. How that doesn't reach that threshold, I don't know. But I don't think anyone in Australia would accept that this is Australian values on display, that these are standards we accept for Australia. In fact, I think these are the sort of views that we want to protect Australia from, and to ensure that we remain a country that likes coming together, that likes living in freedom and stability and peace, a country that doesn't encourage terrorism.
Stephen, it's not the Australia I grew up in.
I can understand that. It is kind of the Australia I grew up in. I grew up in Sydney's Bankstown, and that wasn't unusual talk, particularly after 9/11. I think it's important to remember that when a Christian talks about martyrdom, they're talking about being killed by religious persecutors. When Muslims talk about martyrdom, they are talking about killing others and killing themselves in the process, two very different things, which means whenever anyone of the Islamic religion praises martyrdom, they are praising killing innocent civilians, they are praising terrorism. That is the kind of talk that should be considered incitement. And people who praise martyrdom in Australia, who praise Islamic martyrdom, the police need to investigate such people, and if possible, these people, whether they are clerics or not, if they can, they need to be deported. We don't need any of that in this country. And as I said before, this is not just a free speech problem in Australia. This goes deeper. This is an immigration problem, and we need to stop pursuing a reckless immigration policy that cares nothing about the kinds of communities that are emerging in this country.
Yeah, it's a dangerous line we've crossed, I think, sadly. Stephen Chavura, Garth Hamilton, thank you very much for your time. Now, coming up straight after the break, we will talk about former US President Donald Trump. He's called Prince Harry a traitor. He loves to get a headline, Donald Trump, as UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak faces another crisis. All to come. Welcome back. Steve Price in for Andrew Bolt. I'll speak with Esther Kraku shortly about former US President Donald Trump. He's labelled Prince Harry a traitor. But first, here's a look at what's coming up next on Shari.
Tonight on the show, the Telegraph's crime editor with the inside word on the double murder in Sydney and the chilling 000 phone call. Plus, our exclusive, the anti-Semitic Greens politician who claimed Jews have their tentacles in everything. Well, she's now been celebrated at a public school. I'll see you at 8.
Good on you, Shari. Now, joining me from London is writer and commentator Esther Kraku. Let's start with Rishi Sunak. He's got to go very carefully right now. He's sacked MP Lee Anderson for making these comments. Have a look at that.
We've got a very cowardly Khan running London. He seems to be letting the not only the Jewish population down, but the whole population of London and Britain as a whole. And I heard the comments here. I heard the comments earlier you was making about Suella, some of the comments she made earlier this week. And I don't actually believe that these Islamists have got control of our country. But what I do believe is they've got control of Khan, and they've got control of London, and they've got control of Storm as well.
The London Mayor Sadiq Khan called those comments Islamophobic, anti-Muslim and racist. Rishi Sunak sacked him, but now he's facing a backlash. There's reports of the inboxes of Tory MPs there are full of support for Lee Anderson. What do you make of all of this?
Well, Lee Anderson admitted himself that he left Rishi Sunak no choice but to remove the whip from him. Rishi Sunak actually asked him to either clarify or apologise for his statements. They were clumsy, they were ill thought out, and they had no basis in truth or reality. He really had no evidence that Sadiq Khan was in the pocket of Islamists. And there's so many things you could level against Sadiq Khan that I don't understand why he chose to make this cheap shot. The reality is, people like Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman were brought in to boost Rishi Sunak's credentials. They were effectively, attack dogs for the Goldman Sachs suited and booted Rishi Sunak, who really had no appeal with traditional working class or even sort of blue Tory voters. And unfortunately, because they have no effectively political instincts, they make these clumsy statements and they leave Rishi Sunak with no choice but to distance himself and the party from them. But obviously, the UK does have a problem with Islamist extremism. Obviously, we have a problem with certain groups not integrating properly into the UK and adopting British values, which is why we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism in literally every police force across the country. But to make these statements really gives a gift to people like Sadiq Khan, who are really not willing to talk about the issues at hand. They're just happy to, take these bullets and make it seem like they're the victims when there is a larger conversation to be had.
Speaking of somebody who is not unknown to make outlandish statements, we've got former US President Donald Trump. Now, he's branded Prince Harry as, quote, unforgivable after betraying the late Queen. He's also slammed the Joe Biden administration for, quote, protecting Harry over whether Harry lied about not using drugs on his visa application. How do we think this is going to play out with Donald Trump likely to be the Republican candidate?
Well, Donald Trump certainly knows how to make a headline. I'm sure if and when he does actually come back to power, he'll probably not make Prince Harry a priority for him. But, Donald Trump's admiration for the late Queen has always been very evident. He always has been very critical of Harry and Meghan in the way that they've exploited their royal titles, how they've disappointed the Queen and made the last few years of her reign really quite insufferable. But there's now a court case going on with Harry's immigration status and his immigration documents because he has admitted to using drugs, and we know that the likes of Nigella Lawson and other celebrities have been prevented from entering the US for using drugs. But for some reason, Prince Harry has been allowed to not only enter but stay in the US for the last few years. So now this is being contested. His immigration records are being requested to be unsealed, so we can actually see whether he declared having used drugs. Unfortunately, a lawyer from the Biden administration has had to stoop so low to even admit that the things that Harry said in his memoir may not have been true to try and protect Prince Harry from himself and his own blabbermouth.
Shock horror.
So we're going to see how that will play out.
Shock. What a shock, Esther. Can you imagine that? Thank you very much for talking to us. That's Esther Krakow there in London. Thank you very much for your time. Now, coming up next, that's it from me, but Sherry Markson's up now.